Two big stories dominate the week: the hundreds of millions we can't spend and the hundreds of thousands of refugees we can't help. Welcome to The View. Tonight, the Finance Minister insists there's just one solution to the current spending deadlock.
We're wasting our time discussing propositions that the DUP put forward that can't work, which they know cannot work.
The problem...
The Home Office has been facing scathing criticism for its handling of the refugee crisis, including from within its own Conservative ranks.
The problem is that the Home Office seems to be, I don't know what we call it, the most sclerotic of all the government departments, the least flexible and the most bureaucratic.
Plus, what happened when the former DUP MLA Alex Easton left the party.
Was basically told that if I didn't come back, they were going to run two Assembly candidates against me, and they would run a high-profile candidate against me if I dared to run for Westminster.
And joining me with their thoughts on what we're discussing, Fionnuala O'Connor and Sam McBride. Hello. Stormont leaders are to meet finance officials tomorrow in an effort to resolve the row over how the ongoing funding crisis can be resolved. It comes as households deal with a cost of living crisis, record-breaking fuel prices and increasing food costs. I've been speaking to the Finance Minister, Conor Murphy, and I began by asking him if he's worked out how to spend the additional £300 million at his disposal.
Well, I've worked out that I can't until an executive is in place, and I've taken clear legal advice on that and spoken and had written legal advice from the Attorney-General. And the reality is you can't allocate money into the future unless there's an executive decision around that. I had executive decisions which covered me to allocate money over the last number of weeks, but that was on a decision previously taken. The plan for the executive always was to maximise the carryover into the next financial year, because that's where a lot of pinch points would be, and that's actually increased now with the cost of living issues that are rising. And so it was always the plan to come back to an executive and decide how to allocate that 300 million, as well as doing the draft budget. And without an executive then, it's very clear I can't allocate that money.
If the other ministers around the table agreed with you allocating that £300 million, what would the consequences be of you allocating it?
Well, I asked all these questions when I sought legal advice. I was told very clearly that the law says an executive has to agree. There is no executive can sit. The executive can't sit unless you have a First and Deputy First Minister in place. And you can write to other ministers, and other ministers have done that to try and take decisions in and around areas where there was some scope of agreement, some measure of agreement prior to this. But when you're deciding to allocate funds to projects which have not yet been identified in the next financial year, then you cannot do that without an executive place. The law is very clear in relation to that, and I've tested that, I've pushed that, I've tried to find ways around all of this to make sure that I can take decisions, but I've been told under no uncertain terms that the law is clear. An executive has to take a decision. It doesn't mean a collection of ministers, it means a properly constituted executive.
But the DUP says that precedents have been set that could be followed. You allocated £45 million last week. Robin Swan took a decision to end all COVID restrictions. There's an apology being made to victims of historical institutional abuse. Those decisions were taken because there was a knowledge that the other ministers sitting around the executive table, notionally, because of course the executive doesn't exist, but the other ministers with responsibilities in terms of the government here agreed with those decisions. They wouldn't challenge them, therefore the decisions were able to be taken. You could do the same thing now if you wanted to.
No, actually, those decisions were taken because there was an agreed executive position. There's an agreed executive position that restrictions would not last in place any longer than was necessary. That was always the executive position. There was an agreed executive decision in terms of spending that £45 million that I would allocate further funds and manage the transition of the other funds into the new financial year, but not how they would be spent. So those were all on the basis of agreed executive decisions, followed through by ministers saying to other ministers, we agreed this, didn't we? I want to go ahead with it. So it's not the same. And as a matter of fact, I mean, the DUP have been thrashing around trying to find ways to do this thing. The very simple way to do all of this is to go and tell the Speaker that they're prepared to nominate a First Minister again, have the Assembly recalled within a matter of days, nominate a First Minister, get the Executive sitting around the table.
The DP's made it very clear it's not going to do that. So why waste your time, asking for it when it's not going to happen?
But with respect, we're wasting our time discussing propositions that the DUP put forward that can't work, which they know cannot work. They know that these propositions can't work, and they're creating smoke screens to avoid facing the elephant in the room. Is that they've pulled down the Executive. People are suffering as a consequence of them pulling down the Executive. We can't assist people who are facing hardship through the cost of living increase. We can't allocate a budget for the health service next year and deal with waiting lists and cancer treatment services. All of those things can't happen because the DUP won't go into the Executive. The simple solution and the only solution to all of these matters is that the DUP nominates a First Minister. The Executive still have 2 weeks left of the mandate. We can meet and take decisions in the next 2 weeks.
OK, well, look... let's go back to the £45 million of funding that you allocated last week to cover teachers' pay, TransLink expenditure, housing executive expenditure and the DVLA. And in your statement, you said the decision stepped outside the normal procedures to allocate funding without executive approval. That's what you said. But you felt it would be unforgivable if funding that could be used to support local people was returned to the Treasury because of the absence of an executive. So you said yourself you stepped outside normal procedures last week. Why won't you do it this week?
Because normal procedures are that even with an executive decision as to how I would spend out money at the end of the financial year, which I got in January from an executive, I would normally go back to say, this is exactly where it's going. We had a situation where only 3 departments had bid for money, and I agreed to split that between the 3 departments. And that was following through on an executive decision which had been taken. There's been no executive decision on how to spend the 300 million, so therefore I cannot make up something and then go and just write round all the ministers and say, this is how I'm going to spend it.
There have been all sorts of suggestions on the table, a private member's bill at Stormont, potential legislation in Westminster. Have you explored all of those potential avenues?
Firstly, I only heard of the other suggestions last night on social media. So nothing's been put in. I'm very happy to explore anything, but I have pushed the boat out. I have tried to find ways around the blockage that the DUP have created.
The problem for you is it sounds like you're political point scoring here. It sounds like perhaps to some people that you're actually in a position where you're able to criticise the DUP, and you're more interested perhaps in doing that than you are in trying to find solutions to the problem that we're facing at the moment.
Well, as I've said to you, when the DUP walked out of the Executive, I immediately went myself to get advice to see could I continue on making decisions in relation to allocations. I pressed that out. I went and met the Attorney-General and talked through the legal advice with her. I've asked them again to restate their legal advice. I have been proactive, not waiting on the DUP to come up with false solutions to all of these things. I have been proactive to try and push the boat out as far as I can, and I know where the brick wall is in all of this. So rather than trying to find our way to get the DUP off the hook that they're on, I think it's important just to say the simplest, most straightforward solution is for Jeffrey Donaldson to contact the Speaker's office.
You've said that many times. There's not really much point in saying the DUP is absolutely adamant that that's not what it's going to do.
We have spent 5 or 6 minutes here trying to explore solutions that they apparently put forward which aren't going anywhere, as if they're valid solutions to the problem we have. There is only one solution, that's to reform the Executive. OK, this money can of course be moved into the next financial year. It wouldn't have to go back to the Treasury. The difficulty is there is no guarantee that there will be an Assembly, never mind an Executive, after May the 5th. So the money still couldn't get spent under those circumstances, potentially? It could sit in limbo.
It's a ridiculous situation. There's £300 million sitting there on the table from the Treasury. People here are in great need. You're the Finance Minister, and you and your fellow ministers cannot find a way of spending the money.
And it is a ridiculous situation. Absolutely a ridiculous situation, and I am more frustrated than anyone because I know firsthand in engaging with people what problems there are out there in society. I know that we have money available to try and address some of those issues, and I know that I want to take decisions so that we can do that, but I'm hamstrung in terms of the position of the Executive, and there is nothing I can do in relation to that. So yes, every single party, with the exception of the DUP, are frustrated and angry at the position that we're in. Every party, and they expressed that in no uncertain terms to Jeffrey Donaldson today. Okay. But he continues to leave us in this limbo position, and he needs to back out of it.
All right, so you had a meeting with the party leaders today. There is another meeting tomorrow morning, as I understand it, at 8 o'clock, with political representatives and finance officials. What's the point in having that meeting if the only solution is the DUP redesignating a First Minister?
Because the DUP apparently want to hear firsthand the legal advice. Every other party leader accepts.
But it's a waste of time as far as you're concerned.
Well, I wouldn't be against any meeting. If the DUP are going to come in tomorrow and have a rethink on the position that they expressed today and come in tomorrow and tell the other party leaders, OK, we've now exhausted that. The solution that we put forward is clearly not a runner. There is only one way we accept that. Let's renominate. Let's fight the protocol issue somewhere else on the other side of the election, wherever we want to bring that to. But let's not continue to damage the people who are on waiting lists, the people who are waiting for support with their heating bills. Let's not continue to damage them. Let's go and stand up and work together to try and resolve it. If they're going to come in there tomorrow morning, there's every purpose to that meeting. If they're only simply come in to listen to the legal advice, then go off and try and come up with some clever device, then it is a waste of time in a meeting. But we are duty bound to explore whatever options are there, and duty bound to continue to meet with the DUP to impress on them the foolishness of their decision.
It's pretty obvious that you're frustrated, but you must understand that people watching this will be hugely frustrated as well. You're looking for votes in 8 weeks' time, as are other party representatives. Can you understand why people who might bump into you over the next couple of months would just say, look, forget it. If you can't sort this sort of thing out, a plague on all your houses. We are not interested. You are not fit for purpose. You are not worthy of our support at the ballot box.
Well, people are much more discerning than you give them credit for. People can see clearly when I speak to them. I did a lunchtime engagement today with businesses right across Belfast, and I spoke about these issues and I engaged with people. Everybody's very clear what the problem is here. Everybody wants to see...
I think you'll find people who support the DUP will say that as you define it, that's not how they see it.
Well, I'm talking about a broad section of people who weren't... It wasn't the Sinn Féin Supporters Club by any stretch of the imagination. It was a broad section of businesses brought together by Belfast Chamber, who I addressed and I took questions from and I engaged in dialogue with. And they're very clear that they want to see an executive in place. They want to see allocation made. They want to see the 3-year budget being dealt with. They want to see people being supported. And they know what the solution to get that back in place is. So it's not a plague on all your houses. People can understand what the problem is here. And you know, power sharing has been an experiment and it has stuttered and stammered over the years. But, you know, they really will place a big question mark as to whether there is a future in relation to power sharing if we can't get this thing back together. And as I say,
let's not forget that Sinn Féin took exactly the same measures in the past. When it suited your political purposes, you pulled out of Stormont as well, and we had a hiatus that lasted several years.
Well, let me address that. Firstly, no party would have survived the RHI scandal. No coalition would have survived the RHI scandal.
I know you'd have reasons for justifying that. I'm saying you just did exactly the same thing at the time. You say it was right, and now the DUP is wrong to do it, and the DUP will say, you know, the converse of that.
Well,
politics.
In order to share power, you need confidence between the parties who are sharing power. When one party is off involved in the RHI scandal, unknown to their partner in government, then that clearly undermines confidence. In this issue, the DUP are taking action, which is not the responsibility of the executive. It's nothing to do with power sharing arrangements. It's between the EU and the British government, and very clearly and demonstrably, the action that they have taken hasn't as much as caused a ripple in those negotiations. It's having no impact whatsoever.
Well, that's not how they would see it. Sammy Wilson says that's not the case. He says people are coming up to him constantly in Westminster telling him that that things need to happen, that the DUP say need to happen.
I invite you to go down the street and talk to anybody here and see is it being impactful. It's not being at all. And the only people it's damaging are the people, the DUP and the rest of us represent.
OK. I want to ask you one final question. It's about integrated education, because the Assembly backed Kelly Armstrong's bill requiring the Department of Education to give more support to integrated education. And your party backed that move. Your colleague Pat Sheehan said today, our society has taken a positive and progressive step forward as the integrated education bill passed in the Assembly. Do you agree with him?
Yes, I do. And that doesn't mean to the detriment of any other sector. There are the ability to choose education setting that your kid will go to. And what we want to see is support for all those. But there were agreements made in relation to the integrated sector which weren't fully implemented, and what this bill does is I suppose honour those agreements in relation to that. And I think it is progressive, and the fact that parties lined up to give support to it, I know other parties didn't. The DUP tried to deploy a petition of concern which has never been used since we went back in the executive.
It wasn't successful.
It wasn't successful. Thankfully it wasn't successful, but I think it is a progressive step, and we do want to see people being able to choose the education system that suits them best.
OK, so it's interesting you say it's a progressive step, because the reason I ask is last July, your party's former Education Minister John O'Dowd told the Assembly the integrated sector did nothing to promote Irishness and was seen by many as promoting a British identity. If the integrated sector is serious about respecting all identities, he said, it has to get its head around that one. Very few integrated schools play Gaelic football and none promote the Irish language. So did Mr O'Dowd speak out of turn last July.
Oh, I'm sure we could go into every education sector and make criticisms of how they approach schooling. What we want to see is as a society and schooling system...
He says it promotes a British identity. You say backing integrated education is a progressive move.
Yes.
Which is it?
Well, it is. It can be both, because we can criticise every single education sector. I'm sure there are elements of every education sector that people can genuinely criticise. But what we want to see is an opportunity for people to educate their kids in the settings they want to educate them. We want to see those sectors improve. We want to see them more reflective of society. There are other issues as well as identity in society, gender issues, sexuality issues that we want to see schools
so here's
being
my
more...
question.
Sorry, just to finish the point. We want to see all schools being more progressive. An integrated sector could be more progressive in terms of the issues that it promotes as well. Okay. And so I think it's a valid position to support them and ensure that they are supported going forward. All of the school sectors have areas that they can improve
Okay,
on.
so here's the final question. Will we now see Sinn Féin making demands of the integrated sector to do more to promote a sense of Irishness in schools? Will we see demands for integrated schools to be required to offer Gaelic sports and Irish language classes in future? Would that be the line that a future Sinn Féin education might take?
No, well, this isn't a quid pro quo. So we didn't support the bill yesterday in the Assembly in order to make demands of any sector. What we do in general terms, and that's what part of the language legislation was about, was to create a commissioner for standards.
But do you agree with John O'Dowd that the integrated sector, as it's currently constituted, doesn't do enough to promote Irishness? That's what he said.
I think that's a valid criticism. But I think there are other sectors who don't do enough to promote sexual orientation, understanding and gender equality. I think there are other sectors who have other deficiencies. So what we want to see is all sectors doing better across the full range. This is a very diverse society. It's a very progressive society, despite the views of some. And I think our education system across all the various sectors needs to reflect that.
OK, we need to leave it there. Minister, thanks very much indeed for coming in to join us. Conor Murphy talking to me earlier. Let's hear from Fionnuala and Sam. Fionnuala, are you persuaded by Conor Murphy's case that he can't spend this money, £300 million in total?
Well, it's yes, I am, as the other parties appear to be also. He does appear to have legal advice that tells him he can't do that. And I do think it's a bit ridiculous of the DUP to be complaining about this, and for Jeffrey Donaldson to be suggesting that the other party should find a way around a situation that the DUP brought into being. It's very much in the line of succession of the DUP's shenanigans in the past, when they pulled ministers out and put ministers back in again. Playing games with an executive for your own party policy is not a very winning line to take. And I thought Conor Murphy, not somebody I find very sympathetic ordinarily, I thought he made the point pretty well that this is a protest against something that has nothing to do with Stormont, nothing to do with the executive. And here they are penalising people as a result.
Sam, has the DUP backed itself into a bit of a corner on this one? All the parties, as Fionnuala says, are united in claiming that party is solely responsible for this logjam.
Well, I think that the DUP are solely responsible in the sense that they walked out of the executive, they have brought down the government. I think Conor Murphy is also right when he says that he cannot bring a budget. I think it's clear that any legal advice would say that. That's written very clearly in the Northern Ireland Act in Section 64. So that's not really in question. I think, though, there is a less clear question here as to whether there can be some creative way found of spending this money. I'm not convinced that there is no way in which this money can be spent. It was not going to be spent by the end of this month anyway. We're almost at the end of the current financial year. We're days away from that. It was always going to be next year. And we've seen in the past lots of ways in which this can happen. Westminster can step in. They are ultimately sovereign. But also there are creative ways. Jeffrey Donaldson putting out today the idea of cutting rates might seem like a crazy idea. It might not be the best way of spending the money, but it's a pretty simple way of spending it. If you don't take the money off the public to the tune of £300 million by cutting rates, you don't then need to give it back to them. Now, it might not go precisely to the right people, but I'd be very surprised if they don't find some way to spend this money. I think, though, the key point here is political. This is about the DUP struggling to explain why it walked out of government, and more to the point, why it was so important to be in government for a certain period, because the executive is crucial, as they said. But now that they're out of the executive, there's all these other ways that they can do these things. They didn't really need the executive. That's a very mixed message, and it's going to continue with other issues, even if this one can be resolved.
Fionnuala, there's an election in 8 weeks' time. Politicians are going to be looking for votes, knocking on doors. We've seen spiralling food, fuel and energy costs. People are desperate for money. There's £300 million sitting there. You can understand why ordinary people are saying, how come our political representatives cannot find a way to spend the money which the Treasury has given them?
I think it all depends on which ordinary people you're talking about. There are an awful lot of ordinary people who say the DUP brought this on themselves. I mean, there is, as you say, there's an election in the offing and everybody is positioning. There's a lot of positioning going on. So we could have heard some more about the SDLP's proposition that they try to find a way around this.
He was quite dismissive of that.
And he was totally dismissive about that. And that's classic Sinn Féin. They're never going to give the SDLP credit for anything else. And the SDLP would very much like to show up Sinn Féin in the same way. But, there is an awareness out there that it is the DUP. They've brought it on themselves. It's part of this backing themselves, as Sam said, into a corner.
Sam, just quickly, if you would, do you think this will end eventually when the Secretary of State has to intervene?
Well, I think that there is less power in the argument that we're in a massive crisis because we've been here before. This all sounded very scary the last time it happened when Sinn Féin walked out of government. We know that we can exist without a budget because ultimately Westminster will step in. There's an element of moral hazard there, but I think that most people think that is ultimately what will happen.
OK, we need to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed for now. Well, despite the latest announcement by the Home Secretary and what she insists will help Ukrainian refugees, her efforts so far have faced scathing criticism from all quarters. The Conservative MP Tim Lawton is a long-standing member of the Commons Home Affairs Select Committee. When I spoke to him earlier tonight, I began by asking him if he's been surprised by the approach being taken by the Home Office on this issue.
I think exasperated would be a better term. I mean, given I think the government has made some really good moves on helping out in Ukraine, from the Prime Minister rallying Western democracies to provide support, to the sanctions, to the huge amount of humanitarian aid and, importantly, military aid that we've given. I think we've done really well and can be proud of that. We appear to have been let down by the Home Office saying the right things, coming up with the right plans, but completely lacking any sense of urgency, it would seem, in implementing them when we've got a potential refugee crisis on our hands now, and this should really have been seen some weeks ago.
The committee heard from the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council, Enver Solomon, yesterday, who said it was policy over people that the Home Office is using a complex bureaucratic immigration system designed to try and make it more complex and more difficult for people to have a legitimate reason to stay in the UK. That immigration system is not the mechanism we should be using to respond to a humanitarian crisis, he said. Do you agree?
I do. And Enver Solomon also used the term that the Home Office seemed to be wedded to a managed migration system and trying to tweak it for the Ukrainian situation, whereas we are actually dealing with an emergency refugee crisis, and you need to be able to act much more swiftly, more flexibly, and to show compassion, which we all want to be able to give to the Ukrainians, and all our constituents want to make this happen as well. But the Home Office, I'm afraid, is very clunky and far too bureaucratic. Now, since yesterday, we've had further announcements from the Home Secretary today, which I think has helped a lot in streamlining the system for those with passports to come here. But there's still an awful lot that needs to be done. Now, with over 2 million people having come across the borders into places like Poland, in particular Hungary, Moldova, I think we need to still be acting more urgently to take the pressure off those countries and the huge insurge that they've had of mostly women and children and elderly people who are particularly vulnerable.
So I wonder, do you also agree with Mr. Sullivan when he said the UN Convention on Refugees allows the UK to classify all Ukrainians seeking sanctuary from the war as refugees, and in one fell swoop it could be done straight away, he said. Do you support that call for those individuals to be formally classified as refugees?
Yes, we can do that. There's lots of other practical things that the Home Office can do very quickly. I've suggested two things, which again came out of yesterday's meeting, and I suggest them again to the Home Secretary today. We can suspend the carrier's liability which is where airlines get fined because they take on board people who haven't got the right visa clearance to come to the UK. We can suspend that for Ukrainians. So those Ukrainians who can turn up at Krakow airport of Warsaw or whatever and get on a flight to the UK. And then we can deal with the checks. And I agree, we do need to have checks at this end in relative safety and good order. Or secondly, they can just remove Ukraine's name from the list of restricted countries, so anybody can come who's a refugee and get effectively a visitor's visa for 6 months, in the same way as American tourists arriving at Heathrow Airport could do as well. And we do checks when we're in this country. So there's lots of things we can do to be more flexible, but importantly, to be more urgent in the way we're dealing with helping these people.
You have served on the Home Affairs Select Committee for quite some time. You're a long-standing MP who's had responsibility for scrutinising the work of the Home Office. Do you think there's been a failure, frankly, on the part of your committee, on your part, I suppose, also as an individual MP, to spot some of these difficulties in recent years? Because this is not the first time this has been a problem. We saw similar issues being raised in connection, not so very long ago with Afghanistan.
Well, I've been on the committee for 8 years, and in those years, we've produced some very hard-hitting and often very critical reports calling for a lot of change. So the fault is not with us, because we have flagged up problems as we've seen them over many years, dealing with different refugee crises and dealing with different aspects of the immigration system. The problem is that the Home Office seems to be, I don't know what you call it, the most sclerotic of all the government departments, the least flexible and the most bureaucratic. And it's got to change. And we've done remarkably well in this country in our response to the pandemic with the rollout of vaccines and some of the emergency stuff that we brought in, and were very quickly, very urgently able to adapt to new circumstances. For some reason, and I still don't understand why, the Home Office seems incapable of doing that. And that's where the fault is. And I'm afraid it's through no fault of the Home Affairs Select Committee, sort of flagging up some of these shortcomings over many, many years. But still, the problems are there.
Mr. Lawton, the Daily Telegraph reported a source in your government criticising the Republic of Ireland's refugee policy. That source reportedly said, because of the common travel area between the Republic and the UK, a back door had been created into the UK. Your colleague Simon Hoare, another Tory MP, the chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, said the government would be better off copying Ireland's example rather than criticising it. Do you agree with Simon Hoare? Or do you agree with the source who spoke to the Telegraph?
Well, this is a humanitarian refugee crisis. I don't want to get hung up over niceties around the Northern Ireland-Irish Republic border and the implications of Brexit for making any criticisms of anyone. The UK has a role to play. We have said we absolutely want to step up and play our part in helping those refugees, as we've played our part, I think, extremely well in backing the people of Ukraine in their fight. So I just want to make that happen, and there will be some checks which need to happen, and there's a specific situation over the Northern Ireland Irish Republican border. We know about that, but at the moment this is an emergency. We need urgency about getting people into the United Kingdom, and that includes in Northern Ireland as well. And then let's work out the niceties of any problems over backdoor entry or whatever it may be then. Let's get the people here first, and we can sort that out later.
So just finally, if you had the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, in front of your committee in the next day or the next week, a fellow Conservative MP, of course, what would you say to her?
Well, in fact, next week we've got the Immigration Minister, Kevin Foster, who's coming in front of us to take questions about the Ukrainian situation, and we'll be pretty tough on him if by then, it's next Wednesday, the new scheme should have started, and we want to see how many people have so far been processed, because that's just for passport holders with family connections. We want to see those people who escape without all the paperwork that they need. How many of them have been processed as well? My plea, and I've said this to her face, to the Home Secretary, is let's just get people out of that of the chaos that's happening around the Ukrainian border. Let's use the military planes that are doing a fantastic job taking in military aid, humanitarian aid, medical aid, and coming back empty. Let's fill them up with those people who clearly have come out of Ukraine, who clearly need our help and support and want to come to the UK. And then let's sort out all the niceties about the checks. I agree those checks need to be happening, but much better if they were to happen at Gatwick Airport or Luton Airport or whatever in a secure and safe environment. And then we can all say, great, now we've got you here, let's make sure we can look after you properly until it's safe for you to be able to go back to Ukraine, as the vast majority of the people just want to be able to do.
The Conservative MP Tim Lawton talking to me earlier. Now, the former DUP MLA Alex Easton says he didn't feel valued as a member of the party and has no regrets about quitting it. He now sits as an independent at Stormont, though he says Sir Geoffrey Donaldson did make a half-hearted attempt to convince him to rejoin. Mr Easton's been speaking to our political editor, Enda McLafferty.
Well, at the time I was deeply unhappy. There were various reasons why I was unhappy at that particular time, and one was the infighting within the party, which was just absolutely awful. Also, I was fed up with people briefing the press, trying to damage me personally. And I was also fed up with the way the party was handling the Northern Ireland Protocol at the time.
And was it a personality issue then with the people who were involved in a lot of that briefing and counter-briefing?
No, it was faceless figures behind doors. Nobody ever came to you and discussed if they had an issue with you. It was all done behind closed doors and secret conversations, and that's just not my style, and it's just not me, and I didn't want to be a part of that anymore.
And so when you indicated within the party that you planned to leave, was there any attempt at all to try and convince you to stay?
Well, when I left, I just left. I didn't discuss it with very many people. The reaction was very quiet at the time. I didn't get very many people coming to me from the party. The new party leader then did come to me several months later. He came to my office and we chatted for 10-15 minutes. But my issues weren't really listened to or addressed, and I felt that I'd done the right thing at the time.
So Geoffrey Donaldson tried to convince you then to come back again?
Yes, but I would call it half-hearted.
What do you mean by that?
Well, came to my office, spoke to me for about 10-15 minutes. I didn't even get a chance really to give my reasons why I left, and was basically told that if I didn't come back, they were going to run two Assembly candidates against me, and they would run a high-profile candidate against me if I dared to run for Westminster. So
did you feel then that your position was under threat? You were being undermined at the time? Is that the way you felt about it?
Well, I felt it was a bit of a threat. My concerns, I didn't even have a chance to really express them to the party leader. And I felt there was a lack of interest in what the issues were and why I left. So it just reaffirmed my position and how I felt, and that's the way it was left. But you know, we shook hands at the time, and I have a good relationship with him, but I haven't heard anything since.
It seems strange though, isn't it? Because you would have thought, new party leader coming in, given what had just happened within the party, that he would be going to every length and every effort to try and get you back on board, essentially.
Yeah, that didn't happen.
You, of course, were in the DUP for some 20 years. Have you had any regrets whatsoever about quitting the party?
Absolutely not, no. In many ways, it was a weight off my back. A lot of stress went out of my body, as it were, and I felt I was able to breathe and do what I do best, and without having to look over my shoulders all the time.
What do you mean by that? Do you think was the party holding you back, or was it not a comfortable place for you to be?
Just with all the infighting and the carrying on, I just was desperately unhappy. I didn't feel valued, I didn't feel part of the team. I was just ruled out at elections for them, and that was it. So I felt much happier being on my own. you know, I'm good at working on the ground. That's what I do best. And I have a lot more time to do that now. So that's where I'm happiest and that's where I like to deliver.
And what about your own DUP constituency workers at the time, the people who were in the DUP watching you leave it, basically? What was the response from them?
The ordinary rank and file members of the DUP were actually very supportive, and I got quite a few messages and people coming to see me and stuff like that. So they understood my reasons for leaving. Some of the local elected reps weren't as accommodating, and some of them haven't spoken to me since.
And how would you assess the state of the DUP now, as somebody, if you like, on the outside looking in? Has much changed from those turbulent times?
No. From me looking in, I just see turmoil still. I see infighting. It just makes me relieved that I've left, because I didn't want to be part of that. And it's just sad to see a party that I gave so many years to become the way they've become. And it's sad, very sad.
And when you see, for instance, Sammy Wilson standing on a platform in Market Hill being jeered by unionists in the crowd, does that surprise you from what you know and feel on the ground?
I know there's a great deal of dissatisfaction about the protocol. I was somewhat surprised about Sammy Wilson being booed, because I know he was very much opposed to it. But I just think it's maybe a sign that there's problems ahead for the party, and they need to address that.
We know, of course, the election is going to be tight. There might just be a seat in it either way. If we arrive at a point after the polls have closed and you are elected, would you consider rejoining the DUP if it meant preventing Michelle O'Neill from becoming First Minister?
I don't really deal in hypotheticals, but at the end of the day, any decisions that I make in the future will be in the best interests of my constituents in North Down and Northern Ireland, and in the best interests of the Union.
But you're not ruling out, though, perhaps rejoining the DUP if it meant preventing Michelle O'Neill from becoming First Minister?
Well, it's all hypotheticals, so I don't really deal with that. But certainly if unionist parties want to come and talk to me after the election, depending what the result is, I'm willing to listen to anybody. But they have to demonstrate to me they've got the best interests of the union at heart, and that they're willing to unite unionism, because that's not what any of them have been doing.
But you might see, though, how you could come under pressure in such a scenario.
Well, you know, if the DUP had done the right thing and hadn't been fighting and arguing with everybody, they wouldn't be in this position, and it's nothing to do with Alex Easton that they got themselves into that position. So, no, that doesn't stack up.
Alex Easton talking to Enda McClafferty. A spokesperson for the DUP told us the party is saddened by Mr Easton's response. He was a valued colleague and we deeply regret that he resigned. The statement went on. Unionists need to be working together rather than attacking each other at this time. That is what unionists want. And by the way, there'll be a full list of the candidates running in May's election on the BBC News NI website when nominations close at the start of April. Let's have a final word now with Fionnuala and Sam. Fionnuala, how damaging do you think that interview could be for the DUP?
Oh, I think it probably is. It's another indication of the infighting that clearly is still going on. He kept using the word, he kept talking about turmoil and infighting, and we're only getting little glimpses through someone like that. That's more of a glimpse probably than we've had for a while. But it's not that long since he lost the seat to Stephen Farry. The party really were pinning their hopes to him. He lost by under 3,000 votes. That must have been a real turn-up for him, a very upsetting thing. So it's hard to see what that's all about, really.
Sam, Mr Easton's been an impressive vote-getter in Assembly elections in the past in North Down, and he could cause his old party a few headaches in May.
Yes, he is somebody who has a significant personal vote. That's not always the case with MLAs. It's very difficult to tell how somebody performs as an independent once they leave their party, but I think that there are a lot of people who will not be surprised if he gets back into the Assembly as an independent. It's also a very difficult position for the DUP because they've lost both of their sitting MLAs in North Down. Gordon Dunn has died. His son is probably going to stand in his stead. They've now lost Alex Easton, who has left the party. It's a very uncomfortable position. And I think that there's a danger in the party from what he says in really giving the sense of being a liberated person once he's out of the party. This is somebody who gave a huge portion of his life to the DUP, kept his mouth shut, did what he was told, was a faithful and obedient servant of the party. Now looking back, he thinks, what did I really do that for? It's a pretty unseemly picture, I think.
Sam, just briefly, if you would, there is now a vacant DUP Assembly seat in Lagan Valley. Do you expect Sir Geoffrey Donaldson to move in there ahead of May's election?
Well, I think that if he doesn't do that, it's going to be awkward for him. He said that he would take a seat if it came up. He didn't take Christopher Stolford's seat. That went to Edwin Poots. Now there is a seat in his own constituency. Does he really want into the Assembly? Is he willing to give up his Westminster seat? We'll find out within a few days.
Fionnuala, briefly, it's been said before, but could it turn out to be again in May that unionism's problems are nationalism's opportunities?
Well, it's very hard to see beyond unionism's problems at the moment, and they're making hay for nationalism. Everything the DUP does helps Sinn Féin at the moment, and I think the DUP's voters can see that as well. So this is probably just another little straw in that wind. OK,
Fionnuala, Sam, thank you both very much indeed. That's it for tonight. I'll be back with Sunday Politics at 10:15 on BBC One, and we'll have reports on this weekend's Green Party and TUV conferences. And you can look out for the first in our series of Red Lines election podcasts. That's available now on BBC Sounds. But we'll leave you with this. There's been some extraordinary reporting from Ukraine in the last few weeks, but there's also been some that hasn't quite hit the mark. From all of us, thanks for watching. Night-night.
Wardle, the game where you try and guess what news reporters really mean in 5 letters.
These are prosperous, middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees.
Not obviously refugees? What could he possibly mean?
That they're not brown?
Ding, ding, ding. Refugee? More like refugenius. Here's another.
This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
So basically, it's more important because people in Europe are...
white?
Caucasian, yeah! White you are. Well, not really. Otherwise, you'd be on that train. Next one.
These are not refugees from Syria. These are Christians. They're white.
They're Christian and white, so I guess that makes them more... human!
Correct! You've got serious skills, player. Wardle. Don't wait in lines, read between them.